Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Second Features.
Hi everyone.
Yeah, here we are again to talk about Mexican film. I think this is our first Mexican movie.
It is indeed.
Yeah, probably not our last, but I don't know. It's been an interesting one. The film we're looking at is called Santo and the Treasure of Dracula, or, I mean, it's got so many different titles. Um, I keep calling it Sexy Dracula or Sexy Santo. It's what is it? Il Vampiro e il Sexo, or
Yeah, that's the title I had.
yeah, the vampire and the sex, or
The
I don't know.
Vampire and the Sex. What a great
Yeah,
title. The Sex.
um, yeah, but or just sex and the vampire. I don't know. Anyway, it's
I
got
think
a
we sense a theme with our discussions of
yeah.
films in that the more titles a film has, obviously the better the film is going to be,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes, we are. We're back to Sharon's baby again, aren't we? Yes. So yeah, numerous titles. We'll talk about that in a minute. So our guest we'll be talking to shortly is Dr. Dolores Tierney, and she is head of film studies at the University of Sussex, and was also one of my early supervisors on my PhD. So that's how I got to know her, and that she has written a lot about South American and Central American cinema, and with a particular fondness, it seems, for the weird end of the spectrum.
So she'll fit in very well here.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's her natural home. Um, so for me, this was my first Santo movie. I've been aware of Santo for years, probably because I listened to a lot of podcasts on old films, and Americans, particularly who grew up watching this stuff on TV, talk about it all the time. But I'd never really bothered. How about you?
I haven't ever seen a Santo film, or really, I hadn't really seen a wrestling film, to be
Hmm.
honest. So yeah, definitely my first. Uh, I kind of, I mean, it's kind of strange I haven't because it's such a thing, isn't it?
Hmm.
I mean, Santo, the wrestler, did what 52 films or something like
Oh,
that.
tons.
So
Yeah.
many, just over the decades.
And it's not just Santo. There's a bunch of other masked wrestler films from Mexico as well. I think Blue Demon was another popular one.
Uh-huh.
So it was clearly, and I mean, I know so little about this, and I've not even done that much research, but I don't know why it was that Mexican wrestlers in particular had this thing about wearing masks and having secret identities. It's like they were real life superheroes. They would only ever appear in public with their masks on, and presumably like buried with their masks when they died. I don't know. It's such a common thing for Mexican wrestling, but I've not seen it particularly anywhere else. I mean, when I used to watch Big Daddy wrestling and Giant Haystacks back in the
Mm.
80s.
Well, yeah, it's very like I read that that Santo never took off his mask ever, and he would like when he was traveling with his film crew, he would travel separately so that he could take his mask off and nobody would see his face. I don't
Wow.
know if that's true, but that is kind of yeah, that is something that I read.
It's kind of weird, but it can't
It
be very
is
good
well,
for
it is
you.
kind of comic booky.
Yeah.
It's and wasn't Santo like in a comic book or there's something to do with kind of comics as well
Mm.
in relation to kind of Santo. So it is very
Yeah.
like superhero wrestler type thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting that now I suppose we're more used to wrestlers being actors and crossing different across different media, but it's quite interesting. This is back in the 1950s that the wrestlers were establishing themselves as superhero type characters and doing movies from so many different genres. I mean, the one that we're talking about is sort of a horror, but not really, but based on Dracula. And there are other ones where they fight vampires and werewolves and all that sort of stuff. And then there are non horror type ones as well, and just sort of crime ones. And there's no continuing narrative. It's like a different Santo each time. Like in this one, he's a world renowned scientist who's invented time travel.
He's so talented, isn't he? Like
Yeah,
he can just do anything he wants.
yeah. So it's almost like it sort of resets at the beginning of each Santo movie. What's Santo going to be this time? There's no, apart from the mask and the fact that he's good at wrestling, there's no character continuity, I don't think.
Hmm. So I mean, this Sex and the Vampire and the Sex, the
Mm,
this film, the time travel vampire sex film.
yes.
I kind of read as a comedy more than a horror, you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, do you want to have a stab at summarizing the plot, Adrian?
So yeah, why not? Will the I'm glad that you. I was going to ask you, so I'm glad that's good that you got in
I
there
could have
first.
a go. I could have a go. I
Well,
mean,
so originally it came out in 1969 as Santo en el Tesoro de Dracula, which is Santo and the Treasure of Dracula, and it was a straight horror movie. And from what I've read, I think the Santo films were primarily aimed at a sort of family audience. Like these were popular with children. And so it's a fairly straight story of, in inverted commas, with Santo inventing a time machine and he can send women back in time because they're 4 times stronger than men. And so they can handle the process. And I love the time machine is straight out of the that is it Irwin Allen show, The Time Tunnel. It's a very
mhm.
similar design to that, which I liked. And so he sends his girlfriend, she volunteers to go back in time. But it's something to do, it's interesting. It's not just a time machine, it projects you, it dematerializes you, and then puts you into a past life on your own timeline or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really. The subtitles I watched on the Internet Archive version didn't necessarily translate that well,
Yeah,
but that's
this
the
yeah,
impression I got.
I'm not entirely sure how of the veracity of the science, but yeah, they seem. But also, they don't remember. So his girlfriend, whose name was Louisa, gets sent back to a previous life where she turns out to be one of the characters in the novel of Dracula. Basically, I think she's basically like Mina Harker or one of those. But
Mhm.
she can't remember. It's not like she's gone back in time and then like, oh, I'm time traveling now. She's just there in that story. But Santo and her dad, who I think is also a scientist, and they all kind of live in the same house or something, they're all watching her live this past life on the TV.
Yeah.
So I did kind of wonder what the point of the time travel bit was. If he could invent something that does that, couldn't he have just invented a time machine that looked into the past without having to send his girlfriend back to get ravaged by Dracula? But
Um.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, when I watched it, I kind of assumed that they had, in typical sort of B movie fashion, or off the cuff filmmaking fashion,
Mm,
just strung two films together with a framing device.
yeah,
So we had Santo and those actors like look at watching the TV, but the TV is actually like scenes from another
yeah,
film.
it is.
Um,
It feels like a separate movie that they're.
yeah, kind of like that '60s Star Trek episode, the Menagerie, I think it is, when they're watching another episode via like the the kind of screen. Like it's that
Yeah,
kind of setup. But actually, it's they were actually shot to be one film, so yeah,
yeah, because
it like yeah, it just seems like they're two films strung together.
yeah, but the plot is so weird. So she is becoming. I think she is bitten by the vampire, and she's being seduced to become a vampire. Her friend has already died and become one of Dracula's um, harem. And so Santo and her dad just keep watching this thing, and they become a bit obsessed with. Well, they've got to rescue her from Dracula before she becomes a vampire. But also, he's Dracula's got a ring and a medallion. I think he's got two different things, and he tells her, "Oh, that's it." He tells her that the clue to where his treasure is buried is basically in this. If you put these two things together and translate them, and it's in Serbian, I think he said. But anyway, they're in some language, it's got to be translated, and that will give people the clue as to where the treasure is. And so, great. So then he brings her back to the present, and Then the rest of the story is, can they find Dracula's treasure? Now that's in the original movie, but at the same time, they decided that they wanted to sell this film overseas to an adult audience because, why not? Why not stick a load of topless women into an existing Santo film and sell it as a different movie instead of just making another film that's full of boobs? They've decided to put all the boobs into this film.
I mean, it makes a kind of pragmatic sense.
I
Like just
suppose.
add a bunch of shots and then
Yeah.
make more money by selling it abroad.
So if you watch this, but what's weird is it used to be that there was this rumor about this naked Santo movie, Sexy Santo, was
Sexy Santo.
was rumored for years, and it wasn't finally uncovered again in some vault somewhere until I think it was 2010 or 2011. And so before that, the only version you could see was The Treasure of Dracula, which was the standard film. Now it seems to be the other way around, and I have searched everywhere to try and find the original Treasure of Dracula to do a comparison. I can't find a copy of it anywhere. The only film you can find is the Sexy Santo version. So that seems to have supplanted the original as the definitive text now,
I am
which,
shocked that that has happened.
yeah, I know, who would have thought it? But it would
Who
be,
would have thunk?
I'd really like to put them side by side and watch them both on the screen at the same time and look at the differences between the versions of the scenes. But I don't know, maybe one day somebody could do that. But so in that version, it's all the same story, but when she goes back, she's in bed and she is having a lovely time with Dracula, who is breast obsessed, and he's basically just seducing her and bringing her paroxysms of pleasure before he bites her on the neck, and she's just. But what I found with that scene was that when it cuts back later, Santo and her dad are watching this whole thing,
Yeah,
like
I mean,
a bit awkward.
the scene itself is creepy because she's asleep and then she's responding to like
Yeah.
she's having a nice time but she's asleep, so it's essentially sexual assault. And
Hmm.
then we like cut to her own dad and her fiance
Yeah.
watching her be
Yes.
felt up by
By
Dracula on a
yeah.
telly. It
Hmm.
is, and it's not acknowledged how creepy this is.
No,
They're just
it's a
kind of
little
watching
bit
it,
weird.
and yeah, it's a little bit odd.
And Santo is just sort of saying, "Well, now we can find Dracula's treasure." He's not thinking, "Let's just turn it off for a bit and come back later." It's like no one seems to be particularly embarrassed by that. But so that's where they stick a lot of the nudity in, is with her. And then later on, Dracula has this whole harem of women, which in the normal version have all got their clothes on, and in this version they've all got their clothes off. And that's basically where the main differences are. Nothing changes in the plot. It's just that in one sit they shot it once with the clothes on, then they shot exactly the same thing again with the clothes off.
I mean, we have wrestling, we have vampires, we have time travel, we have
Mm.
sex,
Oh
we have
yeah,
buried treasure. It's just all in the mix,
it's
isn't
a
it?
whole hodgepodge, but it doesn't really pan out. So yeah, there's a one of Santo's arch rivals, who we don't know who he is because he's also wearing a mask. He seems to be after. He was trying to interfere with this whole thing because Santo, he, in the olden days, we see Dracula get staked, and then we're back in the new days, and he seems to know exactly where Dracula is buried, and they go and they find him. Oh, because she can remember. That's right. She remembers where Dracula is buried. So they go to the tomb. They find him. He's still there with the stake in his chest, and they take the medallion that's got the writing on it because they want to find the treasure. Meanwhile, this evil scientist guy, oh, sorry, we don't know he's a scientist yet, whoever he is, the masked stranger, he's also trying to get this thing because he wants to get the treasure. And so there's a bit of fighting between them and so on. But then they agree that because his son is also a wrestler, that what they should do is they should have a fight in the ring between Santo and this guy's son, and whoever wins gets to keep all the stuff and find the treasure, which is basically just the excuse that we need to stick in a good 10-minute wrestling sequence.
Yeah. And the wrestling sequence uh, is kind of like it. I don't want to use the phrase money shot, but it's kind of like, it feels like, the point, but also
Yeah,
audiences, like it feels like a part of a different film, but it's kind of specifically for audiences who couldn't watch wrestling
yeah,
easily.
yeah, yeah. We'll talk about that later. I think with Dolores, the fact that wrestling on television had been banned, and that
Mm.
was one of the reasons why these films exist in the first place. But and I did read somewhere, it might have been in something Dolores wrote, that the wrestling in the movies wasn't necessarily staged and directed for the movie. They would film actual wrestling matches and put them in. So it's hard to say whether what we were watching in this film is just one of Santo's regular matches and they just filmed it to use in the movie. But it's I don't know, maybe it's hard to say.
I mean, it's hard to summarize, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
it's a difficult plot to summarize because there's so much going on.
But Santo wins the fight, obviously, and gets the thing. This is where I get a little bit lost with this story because ultimately, the villain, because he loses the medallion, he thinks, I know what I'm going to do instead. I'm going to go and pull the stake out of Dracula and bring Dracula back to life to make him kill Santo. And so then the whole film becomes another battle with Dracula again. Um, and they they kill Dracula, and that's basically the end of the film. Like they never actually find the treasure. So the film is called The Treasure of Dracula, but the treasure gets forgotten quite like about halfway through the movie. They kill Dracula, and that's the end. And they still didn't get the treasure. I did wonder what the point of even having the treasure as a MacGuffin was, because they don't even get it.
Yeah, like whenever I'm watching a film like this, I think of like young kids playing with Lego. The way you make stuff up when you're playing as a kid, like, and then
Hmm.
a vampire turns up, and then he has a time
Yes.
machine, and then he goes to the past, and then he fights a wrestler, and then there's some treasure,
Hmm.
and the wrestler comes and tries to get the treasure, but then the vampire does this, and it
Yes.
kind of like just progresses like that. Does that
And
make
then
sense?
yeah, and then it's bedtime, so it's over and it's all done.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. It is. It's a weird one, but this is probably now because of the notoriety of the nudity, has become probably the most well known of the Santo movies. Even though there, like you said, there's tons of them, and some of them like, there's some quite well known ones in there, but this is probably now the film that everybody talks about and looks for, and it's been hell. There've been screenings at film festivals. I believe Guillermo del Toro was involved in the restoration,
Hmm.
and so
Um,
it's yeah,
so has it
weird.
had a special edition release?
It's I did look, and I think there's a Blu-ray coming. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but it's been a bit slow in getting a release. But from what I can tell, it's only being released on Blu-ray with an English dub because it's being released for an American audience. And there's also a box set coming out in America, or perhaps just out this year, of other Santo movies, but they're all dubbed into English.
Hmm.
And they're new dubs as well. They're not even the dubs from the 60s. They've given them new dubs,
Yeah, I'm not
which
sure
is
how
sort
I
of
feel about that.
a bit weird
Yeah.
because they're appealing to Americans, I think. Because that's the
Mm,
pro. I mean, outside of Mexico, the main audience for these films is that sort of baby boomer generation who watched this stuff when it was shown on television in the 60s.
mhm.
And so those would have been dubbed versions then anyway, I suppose. But for film purists and historians, we want to see stuff in its original language and all of that. But I guess they think that the audience for this film is going to be more just wrestling fans than world cinema fans, I suppose.
So, will you watch any more Santo films, Adrian?
I wouldn't say no. I'm quite intrigued by stuff like Vampire and the Werewolf Women and some of those others. I mean, I suppose I'm actually more interested in Rene Cardona, the director, than I am
Mm,
necessarily in other Santo films. I mean, they're a fascinating family. So there's Rene Cardona who directed this one, and he has, according to the IMDb, he has 146 directing credits, and that's in
Jesus.
a career that lasted about 60 years. But then he had a son who is Rene Cardona Jr., and he also directed a bunch of movies, including some quite notorious exploitation films like Tintorera, which is the kind of Mexican Jaws ripoff.
Oh, I want to
Um,
see that.
yeah, and there's one called the Bermuda Triangle. But the Blu-ray company Vinegar Syndrome just recently put out a Rene Cardona Jr. box set of some
Mhm.
of his films. So he's got cult cachet with some of his movies. He did a film based on the Jonestown massacre as well,
Mhm.
and there's one which I've never seen, which sounds hilarious, called Beaks, which is a kind of Mexican version of the Hitchcock to the Birds. I just love
Uh-huh.
the fact that it's called Beaks. So that's Rene Cardona Jr. He had a son, and you'll never guess what he called him.
Rennie Cardona Jr. Jr.
It's almost Rene Cardona the Third,
Ah.
who actually he died earlier this year, and he was only about 60. But he was also an actor and a director. He's made a bunch of stuff as well. So they're quite a family. Um, and most of the film titles they're in Mexican only, and I don't well in Spanish I should say, or made in Mexico, and I don't understand what most of them are called. So I imagine that a lot of these films probably didn't travel outside. So there's just
Mm.
the occasional ones that have got the cult cachet, like Tintorera from Rene Cardona Jr. That are known outside of Mexico, and then obviously some of these Santo films. Rene Cardona also did a Mexican Christmas movie called Santa Claus, which I have heard people talk about before on podcasts, and I think there might have even been a Mystery Theatre episode on that, and it's a kind of weird Mexican Santa Claus movie from. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that came out from those guys, and they seem the Cardona dynasty, as I suppose we should call them, seem to have specialized primarily in the genre end, like exploitation end.
Mm.
So I'm definitely up for exploring their work a bit more.
Yeah.
Um, but Santo, maybe. I don't know. What about you?
I might do. I'll see what I can get a hold of. I don't love the
Yeah,
idea of watching like a modern dub of these
no,
older films, but yeah.
no, it's a bit lame.
I think I might. I might. It's kind of an interest. It would be a really interesting one to look into with a view to like maybe teaching it
Mm,
on a like a history module because I like to kind of incorporate exploitation stuff because they explain so much about the film business in any
mm,
given era.
yeah,
Actually, I've learned so much more from about how the film industry works from just studying exploitation and kind of low budget genre film.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, maybe.
yeah. It's a shame as well. Like as we said, they had a really good run in the '60s in America, but in the UK, I don't think Santo Films ever made it over here in any kind of formal distribution at all. And
Mm,
perhaps that's one of the reasons why we don't have them as part of our sort of nostalgia, or there's not so much of a fandom. When I was growing up, the films that were on TV all the time were the Hammer films, and
yeah.
so I grew up with a love of Hammer, and that's where my kind of probably where my exploitation leanings come from is growing up watching Hammer movies, um, where I didn't see this kind of stuff; it was just never on, and so
Yeah, I mean,
maybe
it
there's
feels like maybe it would be a late night Channel 4 thing in the
yeah,
late
yeah, well,
80s.
yeah, probably past
Maybe.
my past my bedtime, but yeah,
Yeah.
so it's sort of it's a shame when whole film movements like this just are don't travel to certain areas but do to others. So it feels like we missed out. Perhaps
Mm.
if people in the '60s had enjoyed the enjoyed Santo films, maybe we'd have a whole Santo thing over here, just like there is in America, and masked wrestling would be a bigger deal. But it isn't. I know there are some people who are masked wrestling fans, and I know there was just a couple of years ago there was a live luchador event in London with Mexican wrestling and quite famous masked wrestlers appearing in London and stuff. So it does. There is a bit of a cult around it, I suppose, but it's relatively niche, I think. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast now Dr. Dolores Tierney, who is Head of Film Studies at the University of Sussex. And I should declare here that Dolores was also one of the supervisors in the early days of my PhD and gave me lots of encouragement, which was much needed.
Oh, that's
Um,
nice.
yeah, absolutely. But then Dolores disappeared off to America, and but now she's back and she's head of film studies, head of film, head of film studies. This is very messy. I'll probably edit around this, but anyway, we're very grateful to have you on the podcast. And so when I spoke to you about what you would like to do, you suggested that we talk about the film El Vampiro y el Sexo, otherwise known as The Vampire and Sex, or Santo and Dracula's Treasure, or Santo and el Tesoro de Dracula, from 1968. And so, my first question, I suppose, is why this particular film has sparked your interest, and why you've written so extensively on Sexy Santo.
Okay, so I think what first piqued my interest is in about 2011, the Guadalajara Film Festival was going to show this long rumored sexy version of a Santo film, right? And it had been restored thanks to UCLA and some money from Guillermo del Toro, who's very much kind of about looking after that history of fantastical and horror cinema in Mexico, because it's a tradition he sees himself coming out of. And then, quite sensationally, one of El Santo, this very important Mexican wrestler's sons, stops the screening or protests and says, this isn't a real film. My father's not in this film. This is a spliced version of some sexy bits. And so it becomes this kind of great cause célèbre, and I was kind of interested in it. And then I managed to get hold of a copy, and actually now it's circulating more broadly on the internet, but it was quite hard to get hold of. And I'm always about those kind of aspects of film history that we want to explore and think a bit more about. I'm also interested in exploitation cinema. So I decided to kind of look at it, both the aspect of its original production and then its subsequent kind of re-emergence in 2011 in a restored version, and think about the cultural politics behind those two different moments.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned in one of the articles that Mexico, I know very little. I'll say this right now. I know very little about this area and about Mexican wrestling and luchadors and all of that stuff. And so I didn't realize until I read your article that it had actually been banned on television I think it was the late 1950s. And so that's is that one of the reasons why there were so many Mexican wrestler films, because it couldn't be seen on television?
Yeah, precisely. So Mexican wrestling becomes a really important and significant working class sport in Mexico, very much a spectator sport. And in the 50s, it begins to be shown on television. And then the Mexican government bans it, purportedly because of its bad influence on children. But there's various other reasons why we could think about it, why it might have been banned, because it's a way of the working class getting together and seeing some kind of spectacle, because it's kind of pointing... They were very much a totalitarian government in the 1950s who were very much trying to control expressions of working class culture. So there's broader reasons for it. And that was one reason why it was banned. But what happened was it went into television. And although they might use that footage that had been originally shot for television in these movies, the baddies were no longer recognizable Mexican people. They were the Wolfman or a vampire or whoever, So you've got bits of wrestling in the actual arenas in Mexico, but a lot of the fighting went on with these kind of supernatural baddies, but all following the kind of rules of Mexican wrestling. So it's quite funny how the wrestling goes on all over the place, both in these kind of horror plots and also with kind of bits of found footage from TV that kind of make their way into the films. And potentially that's why they became so popular, because audiences could only see it at the cinema unless they could make it to the arena to watch it, the different arenas in Mexico City and some of the urban centres.
Yeah. So why weren't the films also banned if they were worried about
Uh,
the influence
right.
that they had on children?
I think, and I was kind of rereading that article again this morning, going, "Oh, that's interesting," because I was trying to remember stuff because I co-authored that as well with Andrew Sider, and this was written in 2002, like almost 20 years ago. But we kind of speculated that the translation of these fights into the supernatural meant that they were lifted out of the realm of the social, which was what the Mexican government was finding threatening. Because the wrestling matches, as indeed contemporary wrestling matches, were very much fixed in the 50s and were just some kind of spectacle of one guy fighting against the other. And it was all kind of a little bit fixed. And there was a kind of a sense that people watching these films had a sense of this fixedness of the way things were. And in some ways, these wrestling matches were kind of a critique of this kind of fixed system of governing. But once you translated it into films where the goodies and the baddies were wrestlers versus, as I said, wolfmen or vampires or other things, there was kind of that abstraction from the social sphere. So there wasn't the feeling of, it wasn't perceived as such a threat. They didn't seem to locate it because often also the threat wasn't just El Hombre Lobo. It was often a threat from the foreign. So a lot of these people that they fought was sort of seen as not Mexican. So it kind of became a more nationalist spectacle and something that was being celebrated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because like
So,
Dracula in this film, Dracula is Eastern European, I suppose.
yeah. So it becomes,
Yeah.
but El Santo is always a Mexican national working class hero. No matter who he becomes in all his various different films, even when he's kind of a James Bond figure, he's still insistently proletarian and a wrestler with a day job. He still continues to do a lot of that.
Well, like you, Adrian, I don't really know much about this genre before. I mean, this was my first Santo film,
Wow.
and I just found it so fascinating. And I really kind of loved reading your article, Dolores, because the cultural and social and political context, when you kind of, the sex film is often ignored, but can be so interesting for what it reveals about those structures. And I'm not kind of familiar with Mexican film in the 60s, but I am familiar with the idea of genre films, which are kind of cultural, very important culturally to a working class audience, but then sort of derided by critics. I'm kind of interested in studying what those kinds of films reveal. And I think that's what, this genre, you can kind of do that so beautifully. And I really kind of enjoyed it. But is it the case that it's the sexy bits? They were they just for kind of export, just for international audiences?
They were for a little while in the late. So what happens? So I wrote one article in about 20 years ago, or 15, 20 years ago, that was about these kind of initial films from the 50s. And then, or I co-wrote it with Andrew Sider. And then we looked at subsequent kind of emergence in US TV and then the kind of take up in the psychotronic era. This other article, Santo, about El Vampiro y el Sexo, the vampire and the sex, the kind of sexy version, it's a 68 movie. And there was an original kind of straight version, which is Santo nel tesoro de Dracula, Santo and Dracula's treasure, which is a kind of a straight Santo movie where he is a scientist, of course, as well as a wrestler, and he's found a way to go back in time and he sends his girlfriend back to the 19th century where she meets Dracula. Okay, he was on a Mexican hacienda. And then the sexy version, yes, at the time in the late 60s in New York, plenty of a market for much sexier films. There's kind of an explosion of sex playing everywhere that Eric Schaefer and Linda Williams talk about in Sex Scene. And so, yes, there's a kind of a jumping on the bandwagon of the sexual revolution, inverted commas, to make the same film with just some inserted sexier sexploitation-like moments. But several years later, when there's a kind of a liberalization in Mexican film, Santo does begin to make sexier films. only appearing with a few topless women. So it's not as if it couldn't possibly happen in Mexico, 68, but it couldn't have happened in 68 Mexico. It happened a few years later. So yes, these were made for export to the United States only, maybe to Italy, but not to the rest of Latin America, where there were similarly authoritarian states, and not to Spain either, where Franco's censorship wouldn't have allowed it either. As far as I've been able to tell at this point. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I mean, when I was watching the film, I hadn't really kind of contextualized it. I just watched it, and I thought it was two films that had been made at different times, cut together.
Oh.
And then reading your article, I was amazed to find that actually they were kind of shot simultaneously, trying to tease that out and trying to figure it out.
So the big hoo-ha was that Santo's son, El Hijo del Santo, said in the 2011 Guadalajara Film Festival, my father was never in this film. This is a different movie shot or cut, spliced in, which would be an exploitation kind of mode of production. However, if you watch the original Santo and Dracula's Treasure, the matching between the scenes is incredibly precise. It's so incredible. And I think I say this in the article, given the very low production values. So the eyeline matches and matches on action are all taking place only in the sexier version that circulates in not just New York, but the whole of the Spanish language circuit in the United States and some of the exploitation circuit too. You get, topless scenes and a little bit of sexploitation activity. So yeah, it is the same film, matches and everything.
I think you talked about in your article that this wasn't the only film that was shooting hot versions. This was a common practice in Mexican exploitation cinema at that time. Is that right? Or have I?
Yeah, it became. I mean, in 1968, there's 3 other films that have these other alternate versions. El Horripilante Bestia Humana, which is just called Sex and the Beast, or The Horrifying Human Beast is one of them. Blue Demon, nice. And The Invaders, and Female Wrestlers versus the Robot Murderer. So these were 3 others that were the sexy versions.
These titles are so great.
Yeah, such good titles. There's one other film that I'm aware of that because Boris Karloff did 4 films that were partly shot in Mexico in around the same time. There's one I've seen called Fear Chamber, which I know had alternate topless sequences, but not with Boris Karloff in them because he was in bed somewhere in America probably. But when it cuts to the stuff in Mexico, there's some alternate sequences. So.
Oh, good. I have to look for that because I know Boris Karloff did do.
Yeah, he did 4 films, and he literally. I mean, this is a conversation for another podcast, perhaps, but we could do that film. But at one point, he's basically doing the whole performance lying in bed, occasionally talking on the phone, and all the action is happening in Mexico. Bless him.
And also Lon Chaney Jr., John Carradine. I mean, a lot of those current horror veterans end up. So the Mexican films borrow a lot of the kind of universal horror ideas from the 30s. They remake them throughout the 50s and 60s. These then get imported back to the US and dubbed into English quite separately to this film I'm talking about. And then the Mexican kind of movie, some of the kind of low-budget filmmakers or these are industry filmmakers as well, though. So what's quite different is this is not a separate industry in Mexico. It's all part of the same group. They then employ some of these US horror veterans back into Mexico, and it happens quite back and forth. There's a lot of backing and forthing going on in the 60s, actually, between Mexico and the US.
You mentioned earlier about distribution overseas. You mentioned Italy as a place where some of these would go. So, because I know I've seen one Italian fumetti film called Superago versus Diabolicus, and Superago is a masked wrestler who is also a superhero, and there are sequences where he's in the ring doing fights as well as going off to fight supervillains. So it seems like there was a sort of influence of the Mexican wrestler Santo type movie picked up on in Italy as well. But
Wow, I'm not surprised actually. At one point in the United States, not these films, but in the early 60s, Santo was called Samson in some of the US recut versions of his films. And these weren't done by the Mexican directors. These were kind of bought wholesale and shown late night on TV or in drive-ins. And they kind of started getting mixed up with The Sword and Sandals, which is that earlier article that I wrote, co-wrote with Andrew Sider in 2005. So there is kind of lots of crossover.
Oh yeah, it was Kay Gordon
Yeah,
Murray.
and I haven't done any research on the reception in Italy, but I've just seen title cards and lobby cards that indicate these films circulated in Italy.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. I hadn't heard about that movie.
I'll send it you later.
Yeah, I'm writing it all down.
Dolores, I wanted to ask you more about 1968 in Mexico. You make a point in your article of talking about how important 1968 was politically in Mexico, and that when this film started shooting right around the time of quite a significant event in Mexican sort of political history. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the connection there.
Yeah, 1968 Mexico. I mean, I talked about it a little bit in relation to the United States, in relation to a kind of counterculture and a moment in which sex on screen became a representation of countercultural values. And sex itself and liberated sex was supposedly a kind of the counterculture thing. And Mexico itself has its own and quite separate kind of counterculture emerging that's connected to student-based, specifically student-based reactions against an increasingly authoritarian government that is invading university campuses and crushing any student right to protest. And so this is kind of building up in the summer of 68 before Santo Santo against versus the Santo in what's it called, Dracula's Treasure, is made, which is made about October. Lots of things are happening, and then this protest culminates in this kind of summer of violence, which we do actually see. If you've seen Roma recently, the violence that we see being inflicted on students protesting is another smaller scale but still significant massacre that happens in 1971, the summer of 1971. But this particular massacre I'm going to talk about happens on the 2nd of October 1968, where students are protesting in Tlatelolco, part of Mexico City, and hundreds of students and people are killed. And it's this huge kind of trauma that's very much repressed and not talked about. And it's coincident with the shooting of Santo and this movie that we're talking about. So it's kind of, I was kind of interested in whether there was any kind of connection between sex and authoritarian cultures in this film, or whether it is purely something we can only trace to the export market, and whether we could think more significantly about Mexico's counterculture in relation to cinema, because it has been thought about in relation to cinema, but only in relation to art films and films that are kind of verite reflections of that cinema of protest. And the people making these films are not young people, and they are not people who are students. These are older, conservative, white in a Mexican context kind of men who are making films. And yet it is interesting that sex happens to be something that's great and fine and celebrated. And there is none of the authoritarianism of the social milieu is making its way into the film. So I was quite interested in thinking about those moments alongside each other.
Yeah, I found it kind of interesting, like the character of Luisa as Santa's fiancée, and how she kind of experiences sexual pleasure, but also the reaction from Santo to this. It's not, yeah, you're in the article, I think you say this is not kind of punished. And we get to kind of linger on Luisa's pleasure, you know? And yeah, that's quite interesting. I was also going to ask you, because this might sound like a kind of daft question, but I don't really know much about Mexican cinema in the 60s. And kind of for general listeners as well, like, why wouldn't you see sex scenes in cinema like this for a domestic audience in the 60s? Like, why would you not see more explicit kind of sexual references? Why would it kind of be for export, basically?
Right. So other movies made at the time did have kind of references, without being explicit, to people doing the wrong thing, having sex outside marriage, etc. And a kind of a Catholic, patriarchal, totalitarian government that sees itself as the father of the country implies that you cannot show this kind of thing. So although there isn't censorship, there's kind of self-censorship on the part of the filmmakers to not make these kinds of films or anything that might be too sexy. So there's a point at which in the late 60s, that's still very much how it's going. It's not the kind of censorship that you would get in Argentina at the time, where, as I'm sure Adrian does know, Sarli's films, which were very sexually explicit and weren't made with alternate versions, but were just made with that version, were cut to the point of kind of incomprehensibility. So it wasn't that kind. It wasn't post-production censorship. It was kind of pre-production kind of censorship. So it's that kind of mentality that kind of led Santo to say, "My father never made these films. They couldn't possibly have existed." And in 68, Santo himself still not really getting involved in anything that's going on. A few years later, he is doing a few more things and being actually shot in 2 shots with nudish women and in bed with nudish women. So it's slightly more risque. But at this point, it wasn't yet allowed. The liberalisation that happens a few years later is not because the government is any less conservative or patriarchal, but it's kind of an airbrushing of, we are a liberal government. We're having the Olympics, 1970. We had the Olympics in 1968. We're having the World Cup. We are a liberal and open government. And they liberalised kind of what was allowed, but in 68 it still was not yet allowed. Does that kind of
Okay. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think it's also interesting that that the actress that plays Louisa, she is from Argentina, and the actor playing Count Dracula is Italian.
Yes.
So you could look at it as though that the Mexicans are still very much clean and, not getting involved, and the really sort of perverted character who's
Aldamonte.
Yeah, the Dracula who is breast obsessed. He's European, so he's like one of those
Europeans,
and that's completely commensurate with the villains are always the kind of other. Or they're either, sometimes they might be Mexican, either from a previous era, but they might also be European or Argentine. And just to tell you a bit more about Mexican cinema, 20 years previously, in the 40s, they had these kind of quite sexy cabaret melodramas, which were a bit like women's films, only the women were often token dancers who were coded as prostitutes. But we didn't really see anything, apart from the fact they wore high heels and danced with men. And those films had Cuban women playing the sex worker. Right. So, so that's kind of a nice kind of connection, actually. And I hadn't really, but Aldamonte, and Noelia, what's her name? I can't remember. I was trying to remember her name.
Noelia Noel.
I'm sure that's not her real name, but anyway. Yes.
I mean, so Laura, that's sort of similar, isn't it, with British cinema in the 60s? Often, if they needed women, especially if it was women who would be nude or would be more sexualized characters, they'd often bring them in from Europe rather than have cast British actresses. That was quite common, wasn't it?
Yeah. So in 63, there was the film That Kind of Girl, which I know you're familiar with, Adrian, which was kind of one of the first British films to tackle venereal disease. And it stars a woman who is from continental Europe because, of course, it was a different sort of thing. If you had a British actress playing a character who was sexually promiscuous, it was seen by, by the censorship board and in general as more kind of controversial. And Adrian, you've done loads of work on continental imports during this era in the 60s as well. So there was stuff coming in from Europe which was given a freer pass, I think, than kind of British produced films. So they're kind of treated differently, I think. Yeah.
There's a sense that British women are not like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's essentially it. Yeah.
Or if they're like that, even narratively in a kind of Loving or any of the British New Wave films, there's a kind of a punishment for it afterwards, isn't there? You know, if you do, if you could, even if you might not get it away explicitly, or there's some kind of, you know, moral kind of code where it cannot be pleasurable or happy at the very end. I was just thinking that I chose to teach a kind of Loving for my British social wave, that new wave that I'm going to teach next year on British cinema. I'm just giving a guest lecture on it, and I was just kind of thinking about because I rewatched it recently, thinking, oh wow, yeah, you know. But I think I think there's that point at which you can't have sex and it not be unproblematic in the British context. So it's similar. There's a lot of similarities actually. So I end up a lot of the cultural theorists that write about Mexico post 1940 are very much using kind of Richard Hogarth-like ideas to talk about this kind of authentic working class culture. So when I first wrote about this classical cinema for my doctoral thesis, which became my first book, which is all separate work to this exploitation stuff, which was kind of my outlet, I ended up kind of rethinking about a lot of those particular moments. And wrestling became a bit like going to the pub. There was that kind of idea of authentic working class culture and how it was threatened by other elements or preserved in various ways. And that mass culture, the cinema, wasn't necessarily a threat to it either. You know, even if the powers that be, the kind of authoritarian governments that, you know, lasted in Mexico right up until 2000, could emphasize that mass culture was in some way determining or breaking up authenticity in Mexican working class culture. So yeah, it's kind of the moral codes are really similar, and I hadn't thought about that until you just said it now.
Yeah, and you kind of find across various countries like Italy and Britain share a kind of like, you know, the Carry On films, a kind of working class humor and bawdiness that arises from particular strains of working class forms of theatre and comedy. And of course, throughout the 60s in British cinema, the Carry On films every single year topped the box office, were so incredibly popular domestically and so totally kind of, you know, derided by the critics. But it shows a definite split between celebrations of working class forms of culture and history and the sort of more consecrated stuff which was coming out of British cinema in that era. Yeah, and I think you find parallels in different countries of that similar kind of working class culture.
Well, essentially all the kind of up and coming new cinema directors of Mexico from the 60s who made great films, Felipe Casals, who's just died recently, who made Canoa and various other films, like a big hero of Alfonso Cuarón, they were very, very down on this kind of sexy cinema. So there wasn't just the explicit sexy films that were exported. There were sexy films that were more like the Carry On films, where they promised a lot and didn't really show you very much. Called The Bed and other things. And they were all shown and were really popular and were made much, much more. They were the kind of predominant mode or the predominant amount of films that were being made and seen. And yet the people who went on to be the critics and the historians of Mexican film through the 70s, 80s and 90s were very much new cinema directors who had rejected, who weren't making these popular films. And therefore they wrote the history to reject them and to talk about their own films or the films of their friends. It's all very, very dodgy, really. And the great thing about Alfonso Cuarón as a contemporary director is that he loves the new cinema directors like Felipe Casals and others. And yet he also liked all the sexy films that had lots of bawdy humour in. And because Alfonso Cuarón's a big genre director, you know, who loves popular cinema, you know, so it's quite nice to see in interviews, you know, Alfonso Cuarón not letting Felipe Casals, this big art cinema director who's amazing, by the way, you know, he's not letting him be like down on the popular working class cinema. He's like, that cinema is just as important as to who we are. And that's why I like Roma, because Roma emphasizes bawdy humor. It emphasizes what people were watching and enjoying, even though it's an art film. Does that make sense? It's kind of, it references this whole history, this whole kind of period. It comes 70, 71, a couple of years after the period that I'm writing about, but it's all there.
So were the, I'm assuming the Santo films were not critically respected at the time in Mexico.
No.
Just not even the sexy ones, just Santo in general. Were they generally dismissed by contemporary critics?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a point at which I totally understand why they were rejected, in as much as a nation that's talking about its kind of cultural artifacts want to emphasize that which it sees being emphasized in other parts of the world, you know. So in some ways, you know, the same way in which Western culture emphasized art cinema modes, Mexican cinema did the same. All across Latin America, the people who are writing that history are maybe trained in film schools in Europe, and are still writing about that cinema. And it was really only in the US, the kind of cue from a lot of the exploitation and paracinema studies started to happen in the 90s and early 2000s, that younger scholars in the US, in Mexico, but again, mostly journalism-based writers, began to think about the cinema again. But as you know, as recently as 2012 or 13, the director of the National Cinematheque was kind of saying, we won't have an homage to Santo for his 100 years of his birth. But younger people at the Cinematheque were saying, we will, and they did. You know, so it's a generational thing, which is not completely distinct to what's happened in Britain, potentially with a bit more of a lag, which is very understandable due to, you know, slight differences in the way film industries develop. They develop at different periods and different generations as well.
Well, I've run out of questions.
Okay.
And Laura, was there anything else you wanted to?
I wanted to really just chat lots about Santo and the vampire and how much and how, you know, the bits I found really funny.
Go on, tell me what bits you found funny. Go on.
Well, I loved I loved how talented Santo is. He's a scientist, and also he just commands every room he walks into, and he just, like, we first see him and he walks in and goes, yeah, I've done all of my own research and invented a time machine. Obviously. And it's just like accepted, like, of course you have. He's just like a Renaissance man. I loved kind of Luisa. I just kind of really liked that character. I liked the bat on a string. I find that very immensely entertaining. Yeah, I like these sort of, they're watching the film on television, so it's kind of like a film within a film. The fact that it was kind of shot simultaneously and not two separate films, I think is really interesting. And I'd like to go back and actually see that, to see those kind of eyeline matches and see actually how that worked. Because, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think I'm going to watch more Santo films because I was thoroughly entertained. And I love this podcast for exposing me to all these great bits of international culture that I would never otherwise come across, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah. And I did have a look, and it looks like Santo films never made it to the UK back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, really?
It doesn't look like it. I mean, I can't find any evidence of, there's no BBFC certification that I can find, or monthly film bulletin reviews, not just of this film, but just of any Santo movies. They seem to have had a very poor distribution. And even now, you can't buy them that easily on DVD in the UK or anything like that. In America, there's more of a interest because obviously they were shown on television such a lot, as you've mentioned. But I think generally speaking, in the UK, we're completely unaware of, unless you're into sort of psychotronic film, Santo has no resonance for anybody, which is a shame.
It is a shame, but
yeah, it is.
It is. Yeah, I'm trying to think. so they didn't make it to the UK, and I think I might have first seen my first Santo before I even went to. I didn't see it at the National Film Theatre in London, where I saw a lot of the classical Mexican films I ended up writing my PhD on. I think I saw my first Santo film on Mystery Science Theatre 3000, which was a psychotronic TV show in the US, when I went there to do a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of does show you where the sites are and where people get to see them. But I also watched a whole bunch of movies in the Filmoteca, so in the National University's kind of film library in Mexico City. So those films were preserved there in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I did actually watch a lot of them, and then go watch wrestling that night at the one of the big arenas in Mexico City to kind of contrast and compare. I was doing my book research at the time, which wasn't this. This was my thing that I did when I was not focusing on my book research, and I watched a lot of wrestling. So yeah, I think the access to a lot of films is still kind of difficult, and I wouldn't imagine a lot of people are teaching. I do know some people who teach Santo, actually. Ian Smith, I know even Ian Robert Smith. He teaches Santo on his courses. So he's kind of unusual in that respect.
Nice.
Definitely. It's yeah.
I would if I could.
I can, so I might, actually. I can teach it, so I might do. We do a world cinema module in the first year, so...
you know what? Yeah, isn't it? How great, though, to be like, I'm going to introduce you to something culturally different. I'm going to show you a Santo film. I'm not going to show you La Ventura, or I'm not going to show you a Buddha Souffle. I'm going to show you a Santo film. And you can even start with...
Dracula.
Some of the if you didn't want to go with the sexy one because these are first years and you want to scare them, you could show them. You can edit that, but you could show them, Santo versus the vampire women, which they might get more because it has such a universal horror kind of aesthetic. They might be able to get more into that because they'll have a code for reading it by, because it has.
Yeah,
and it's a really good atmospheric one, and the production values are pretty good on it. So that's and Santo in the Wax Museum. Santo versus the Vampire Women and Santo in the Wax Museum are two of my favourite for production values. They're early 60s.
Cool. That's essentially how I teach. It's off the beaten track. It's not a Buddha Souffle.
How amazing!
Very much
not. You know what though? I'm just feeling like I don't get to teach what I want to all the time, because we end up on our modules, don't we, Adrian? And we can't really break out of ourselves sometimes. We all end up like that, don't we?
Well, thank you very much, Dolores, for coming on to talk. It's been really fascinating to learn more about this world that we know so little about.
Oh, well, thank you. And talking to you both today has made me think differently about the work and some of the other areas. So, some of the connection to British social realism I hadn't really thought about, and sex and the way it's portrayed in connection to Britain. So that's quite useful. Thank you.
So that's all for today. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you to our guests, all the interesting chat, and all the things we learned about El Santo and Mexican wrestling films. If you want to kind of give us suggestions for future episodes or just comment on the podcast, you can find us on Twitter. It's @SecondFeatures. And you can also email us. I cannot remember the email address right now.
secondfeaturespod@gmail.com, I think. But I always put it in the show notes if you want to.
Excellent. Yes, and there will be show notes and things that you can read and kind of learn about, in the sort of metadata for this podcast episode. So do have a look. And we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, for a Christmas episode. Maybe.
Maybe. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.